Let's just take a quick look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4. My topic this morning is teamwork. And we're not going to really specifically reference these verses in Ecclesiastes 4, but they're just kind of good to have in the back of our minds. Chapter 4, verses 9 to 12. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. So, like I said, my topic this morning is teamwork. I had the privilege to participate in this summer's Meal a Day Build program. For those who may be unfamiliar with it, Meal a Day started the Build program about 10 to 12 years ago, I think, with the goal to both build permanent structures for those in need and to build characters and perspectives and faiths of young participants by exposing them to the lives and the needs of the poorest of our neighbors in third world countries. This year's program took place in Jamaica over a 2-week period and kickstarted the reconstruction of the homes of 4 sisters from 2 ecclesias that were destroyed when Hurricane Melissa went through last year. Now, I thought I would like to do this work, but I was worried that some leg and hip issues I'd been having would limit what I could do. And it turns out that I actually got physically better through all of the hard labor. And I was the oldest person there, but some other older participants reported the same thing. Physical concerns that we worried about were minimal. So we were blessed. But I also went with the goal of being I think back and I think, I should know myself better than this. But I went with the goal of being like a senior leader and a positive, stabilizing, and motivating influence. Yeah, don't laugh. For the younger people who would be there on the team. And I was wrong, and I was humbled. All of the participants in their 20s, early 30s were there ready to go first thing every morning, and we were up early. And they never complained about anything. They worked really, really hard. In one case, too hard. So hard he had to be taken to the hospital with heat exhaustion and kept a couple of days. The teamwork really struck me. Everyone was encouraging to everyone else. There were a couple of participants who, honestly, when I first saw them, I thought they had no business being here. They were not going to be able to pull their weight from a physical perspective. But while they weren't as capable physically as others, they absolutely did everything that they could. And what they lacked in physical ability, they made up for in enthusiasm and mental energy. When it came their time to go home, the bus rides and the work sites were quieter and they were missed. It was really a beautiful living example of the body being one unit, made up of many different parts, and all of the parts of the body make up the one body. For me, this teamwork was unique. I've never before experienced such sustained and intense teamwork before. There was some coming and going at the end of the first, beginning of the second week, as some left and others joined. But generally, we had 2 solid weeks of 16, even 17-hour days together, working toward a common goal of rebuilding these 4 homes for these 4 sisters and their families. And these long days together were something that I was not prepared for. I enjoy my quiet time alone. But you know, it was good. It was intense and it was meaningful. And it's easier for us to think that this team came together just by chance, by each person thinking that they'd like to participate. But I think we should remember that it's God who put the thought in each person's head and heart. We believe that we are here as an ecclesia intentionally placed together by God. Well, there's every reason to believe that a team brought together for a specific purpose for a shorter period of time should be the same, intentionally placed together by God. And it got me thinking about teamwork in the scriptures. And this brought me to Paul. Now, I don't know about you, but I have always thought of Paul as sort of a one-man machine. One man with unlimited drive and unlimited enthusiasm and with a singular mission. It was all him and he did it all himself. Yeah, he names other people along the way, but in my mind, Paul was 90% and the others would kind of support him along the way, giving the remaining 10%. But in reality, Paul was surrounded by a team. There may not have been 15 or 20 others with him doing the exact same thing all the time, but I don't think he was ever alone. And a little thought tells us that this is true, starting with Luke, who wrote the book of Acts. Paul's story begins at the end of chapter 7, beginning of chapter 8, with the stoning of Stephen. But his life as a missionary only picks up in chapter 13. We don't know when Luke joined Paul, but it may have been in chapter 16. Verse 6 refers to Paul and Silas. Verse 7 says they headed north, and verse 8 says they went to Troas. Then in verse 10, it says we decided to leave for Macedonia. So it appears that Luke was with Paul from at least that point forward, always in the background, but probably there more often than not. Was he always with Paul for the rest of his life? Even through his years of imprisonment in Caesarea and Rome? Through so many of the hardships that Paul recounts in 2 Corinthians 11? You know, in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul's speaking about himself. But we should picture Paul always being there as well. He says, starting at verse 23, I worked harder, been put in prison more often, been whipped times without number, and faced death again and again. 5 different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and a day adrift at sea. I have traveled on many long journeys. I faced danger from rivers and from robbers. I faced danger from my own people, the Jews, as well as from the Gentiles. I have faced danger in the cities, in the deserts, and on the seas, and I have faced danger from men who claim to be believers but are not. I have worked hard and long, enduring many sleepless nights. I've been hungry and thirsty and have often gone without food. I've shivered in the cold without enough clothing to keep me warm. Now, it's possible that only Paul was stoned and beaten. But Luke suffered shipwreck and all of the dangers of travel and the Judaizers and hunger and cold. He put his life aside to travel with Paul and suffer all those hardships. In 2 Timothy, Paul, writing towards the very end of his life, says, only Luke is with me. Luke was always there in a supporting role, quietly in the background, maybe for long periods of time, through the best and the worst. And you know, maybe not so quietly in Acts that he wrote, but he may have been a very active force. But before Luke, there was Barnabas. Barnabas was a Levite from Cyprus, and he was among the very earliest converts to Christianity. We're told in Acts 4 that he sold a field he owned and brought the money to the apostles. Then in Acts 9, starting at verse 26, it says, when Paul arrived in Jerusalem, he tried to meet with the believers, but they were all afraid of him. They did not believe he had truly become a believer. Then Barnabas brought him to the apostles and told them how Saul had seen the Lord on the way to Damascus and how the Lord had spoken to Saul. He also told them that Saul had preached boldly in the name of Jesus in Damascus. The apostles were afraid of Paul. Think about that. Maybe we can picture Thomas being dubious of him. But Peter, James, John. But God helped Barnabas trust that Saul's conversion was real. And Barnabas, probably older and certainly more experienced in the Jerusalem ecclesia, became Paul's mentor. Think about that. Paul learned from Barnabas, and he relied on him in the early days. In chapter 11, we're told the church sent Barnabas to Antioch to help his fellow Christians from Cyprus preach to the Gentiles. And he then went to Tarsus to find Paul, so he could help too. While they were in Antioch, we're told in chapter 13, it says, one day these men were worshiping the Lord and fasting. The Holy Spirit said, appoint Barnabas and Saul for the special work to which I have called them. So after more fasting and prayer, the men laid their hands on them and sent them on their way. And so Paul and Barnabas went together to Cyprus, to Antioch of Pisidia, and to Lystra and Derbe, where the people decided that Barnabas was Zeus and Paul was Hermes. Paul was Hermes because he did most of the talking, but Barnabas was Zeus, not some other random god, but the God. There must have been something impressive about him. And then just as quickly, they decided that Paul needed to be stoned. And I think it's interesting to note that through Acts 13, verse 8, it's always Barnabas and Saul. And from that point forward, something switched, and it became almost always Paul and Barnabas. Saul's name switched to Paul at that time, and he took the lead. Oh, it's always named that way. Why did Luke make this subtle change? He does say that the people of Derbe thought Paul was Hermes because he was the chief speaker. So maybe Barnabas, the mentor, started to take a step back as they traveled around that region. The only time Luke switches to Barnabas and Paul is when they return to Jerusalem. Maybe because Barnabas then more naturally took the lead when they were back at the Jerusalem ecclesia, where he was better known. As they continued their missionary work, they disagreed about John Mark. So Barnabas went one way with his cousin, and Paul went the other with Silas. They were clearly reconciled later, and Paul expressed a deep appreciation for both Barnabas and John Mark in his letters. We could use Barnabas' example to ask ourselves whether there is anyone among us who could use our support to grow, to let their light shine. And is there anyone among us that we should elevate into greater service while we take just a small step back so they can gain confidence and shine? And of course, while Luke writes Paul and Barnabas, Luke was always there too. Now, when Paul and Barnabas went their separate ways, Silas steps in. When the Jerusalem council made their decision about how Gentiles were to approach their worship, Silas was sent along with Paul and Barnabas and another named Judas Barsabbas to Antioch to present the decision. Silas was considered a prophet. He sang hymns with Paul in the Philippian jail. So he suffered right alongside him. He was there through the troubles in Thessalonica, and he co-authored 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He stayed behind in Berea with Timothy when Paul was rushed out of the city and went to Athens. He helped write 1 Peter, and his travels took him to Corinth, to Pontus, to Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And yet, he may be to us just a name we barely remember. One family here aside. There are others, like Aristarchus from Thessalonica. He was seized by the crowd during the riot in Ephesus over the goddess Diana, and he subsequently traveled around Macedonia with Paul and Silas and Luke, as did others who would have had the same experiences. Names we all have heard but don't really place, maybe. Sopater, Secundus, Gaius, Tychicus, Trophimus. Timothy was also among those in Ephesus at that time. We think of the 2 books that Paul wrote to him. But young Timothy was with Paul and Luke and Barnabas and Silas and the others through a great deal. He was from Lystra, which was near Paul's hometown of Tarsus. He was so devoted to Paul and his mission that Paul was able to convince him to be circumcised. Now, personally, I don't think Paul could have convinced me. I am pretty sure I could have come up with a good number of counter-arguments to that. But Timothy did it. He stayed in Berea with Silas when Paul was spirited out of town to Athens. Then they rejoined Paul in Corinth. He went from Ephesus to Macedonia with Aristarchus, there's another name, ahead of Paul on their way to Jerusalem, while Paul stayed longer in Ephesus. He's mentioned in Romans, together with Lucius, Jason, and Sosipater. So he was with Paul in Corinth. He co-wrote 2 Corinthians, Philippians, and Colossians, and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Philemon. He was imprisoned, and Paul considered him a son. And there are others, like Phoebe, a servant or deacon in the church of Cenchrea, who it appears traveled to Rome on Paul's behalf. Like Priscilla and Aquila, originally from Rome, they met Paul in Corinth and traveled with him from there. 5 out of 7 times, Priscilla is mentioned first. Whether that's meaningful or not, I don't know. Like Rufus and his mother, who he says was like a mother to him. Like yet another Mary, who Paul mentions in Romans. Like Junia and Tryphena, also mentioned in Romans. And there are others he mentions: Apollos, Stephanas and his family, Fortunatus, Achaicus, and the list can go on. Bottom line, Paul was not alone. He was a force of nature, to be sure, and he was well selected by Jesus to do the work that was to be done. But he was not alone. It took teamwork with the strengths of many different people who were with him and supported him over the many years. So what are the lessons for us? The first lesson for me is that I can do more than I think I can. With support from others, I can do more. But the second lesson is critical to that. I need to rely on team members. and I need to be a team member. I need to look for opportunities to build up team members and to be a good one myself. I don't need to take the lead, but I need to support others who do. I may need to take the lead, but when I do, I need to thoughtfully bring others with me and lift them up by relying on them and giving them opportunities to serve and to shine. I believe our faith grows when we work as members of a team. And I believe we are responsible, as Paul was, for building up each other's faith. Let's do this by working together and looking for opportunities to work together in ways large or small. God has placed us together. That's true of this ecclesia, and it's true of any group any of us may be working with in his name, from around town, from around the country, from around the world, for longer or for shorter periods of time. We are being built together as stones in a wall. We're being held up by some, we're supporting others, and we've got stones on either side of us sharing the load. All intentionally placed together. Stand together, work together, because brothers and sisters corded together can't easily be broken, or defeated, or discouraged, but are stronger for their unity and can accomplish more for their combination of their unique gifts.